Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation contains graphic descriptions of historical violence and explores disturbing themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. They stretched him on the rack, the creak of the wood and leather a grim promise of what was to come. Under the threat of torture, men will confess to anything. But what this man confessed to was impossible. He didn't just admit to murder. He admitted to a 16-year reign of terror, a spree of savagery so vile it defied human comprehension. He spoke of tearing the throats out of livestock, of devouring men, women, and children. He described hunting in the dark forests of 16th century Germany, not as a man but as a wolf, a greedy, devouring, powerful wolf. This was the confession of Peter Stump, a man history would remember as the Werewolf of Bedburg. And his story forces us to ask a terrifying question. What if the most enduring monster of our nightmares is real? What if the tales of men transforming under the pale light of a full moon aren't just folklore? What if they are distorted accounts of a horrifying truth we've long forgotten? For centuries, we've dismissed werewolves as fantasy, creatures of Hollywood and dime store novels. But the historical record tells a different story. It's a story written in blood, etched into court documents, and whispered in forgotten dialects across the globe. Peter Stump claimed the devil himself had given him a magical girdle, a belt of wolfskin that, when worn, unleashed the beast within. A convenient lie for a serial killer? Almost certainly. But his was not an isolated case. Far from it. Across Europe, from the dense forests of Germany to the windswept hills of France, a peculiar madness was taking hold. It was an age of fear, an age of witch trials and public executions. And alongside the accused witches, another figure was dragged into the light. The lycanthrope, the werewolf. Men and women were put on trial, accused of shapeshifting and committing unspeakable acts. These weren't just peasant superstitions. These were formal legal proceedings with judges, witnesses, and chillingly detailed testimonies. In 1598, the tailor of Chalons in France was executed for luring children into his shop, where he murdered them and, according to the court, cannibalized their remains in the guise of a wolf. The details were so gruesome that the judge ordered all documents related to the case to be destroyed, to spare the public from its sheer horror. In the Swiss canton of Vaud, a man named Jean de la Vaud was accused of riding a wolf to a demonic Sabbath. In the French Jura Mountains, a whole family, the Gandillans, was accused of lycanthropy, their supposed transformations leading to a wave of child disappearances. What was happening? Was it mass hysteria? A continent gripped by a collective delusion? Or was something else at play? The belief in men turning into beasts is one of the oldest and most universal fears in human history. It predates Christianity, predates written language. The ancient Greeks told the story of King Lycaon, who dared to serve the flesh of his own son to the god Zeus. As punishment, Zeus cursed him, transforming him into a ravenous wolf, doomed to forever crave the meat he so profanely offered. The word lycanthropy itself comes from his name. In Norse sagas, the Lufnar were legendary warriors who fought with a trance-like fury, clad in the skins of wolves. They were said to channel the spirit of the animal, becoming unstoppable forces of destruction on the battlefield. They weren't just wearing a costume, they believed they became the wolf. In the Navajo tradition of the American Southwest, there are stories of the skinwalker, a malevolent shaman who can take the form of an animal to inflict pain and suffering. From the Romanian Varkalak to the Japanese kitsune, nearly every culture on Earth has its own version of a shapeshifter. How can a myth be so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the human psyche across thousands of miles and thousands of years? The easy answer is that the wolf has always been our primal competitor. For millennia, we huddled around fires, listening to their howls in the darkness. They were the other great pack hunter, a mirror of our own society, but wild, untamed, and deadly. The wolf was a symbol of everything we feared in the natural world, and perhaps everything we feared in ourselves. The werewolf represents the terrifying idea that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, of law and reason, a savage beast lies dormant within every one of us, waiting for the right trigger to be unleashed. But what if the explanation is more tangible, more medical? Throughout history, there have been real-world afflictions that could have easily been mistaken for a supernatural curse. Consider hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition that causes excessive hair growth all over the body. A person born with this in a superstitious medieval village would have been seen as monstrous, an outcast. To a terrified peasant, They would have looked like a man turning into a beast. Then there is the horrifying reality of rabies. Transmitted by the bite of an infected animal, often a dog or a wolf, the rabies virus attacks the central nervous system. Its symptoms are the stuff of nightmares. The victim becomes agitated, aggressive, and prone to violent outbursts. They foam at the mouth, their throat muscles spasm, causing a fear of water, and they may even try to bite others, spreading the contagion. Imagine a man, bitten by a wolf weeks earlier, suddenly descending into a violent, animalistic madness. To his neighbors, it would look exactly like a demonic possession, the curse of the werewolf made manifest. And beyond the physical, there is the psychological. Clinical lycanthropy is a recognized, albeit extremely rare, psychiatric syndrome where a person genuinely believes they are transforming into an animal. They don't physically change, but in their mind, the transformation is absolutely real. They might crawl on all fours, growl, and insist they are growing fur and claws. One documented case from 1852 involved a man in France who was admitted to an asylum convinced he was a wolf. He told his doctors that his body was covered in thick hair, and that his teeth had become wolf fangs. He would only eat raw, rotting meat, and would attack staff if approached. Could a combination of these phenomena, a rare genetic disorder, a terrifying disease, and a powerful psychological delusion, be the seeds from which the entire werewolf legend grew? It's a compelling theory. It grounds the monster in reality, turning it from a supernatural entity into a tragic medical mystery. It explains the fear, the accusations, the violent purges, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the consistency of the details across cultures that had no contact with one another. It doesn't explain the eyewitness accounts, often from multiple people, who swore under oath that they saw a man become a wolf before their very eyes. And it certainly doesn't explain the confession of Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg, because when the authorities went to his home, they didn't just find a disturbed man. They found evidence. They found something that suggested his claims of a magical, transformative girdle weren't just the ravings of a madman. They found something that made them believe his pact with the devil was real. When the authorities searched the home of Peter Stump, they didn't find a wolf's pelt glistening with moonlight. They didn't find a silver buckle that hummed with dark energy. The magical girdle he confessed to using, the one gifted to him by the devil himself, was nowhere to be found. Stump claimed he'd hidden it in a valley, a claim that was never substantiated. So what was this damning evidence? What did they find that could transform a local farmer into a legendary monster? The werewolf of Bedburg. They found what they were already looking for. They found an outcast. A man who lived on the fringes, who kept to himself, whose neighbors already whispered about him. They found a man who, under the persuasive agony of the rack, would admit to anything. The evidence wasn't an object. It was a confession, extracted with brutal efficiency. In the 16th century, justice was a different beast entirely. A confession was the queen of proofs, and torture was her most loyal handmaiden. Peter Stump was stretched, burned, and broken until the story his accusers wanted to hear poured from his lips. He didn't just admit to being a werewolf. He confessed to a litany of horrors that painted him as a monster beyond all human comprehension. He claimed his pact with the devil began when he was just 12 years old, a lonely boy seduced by promises of power and pleasure. He confessed to killing and eating 14 children, including his own son, whose brains he allegedly devoured raw and panting. He admitted to slaughtering pregnant women and tearing the fetuses from their wombs. He confessed to incest with his daughter and a decades-long affair with a succubus sent by his demonic master. The confession was a masterpiece of terror, perfectly tailored to the fears of the time. It hit every note: black magic, cannibalism, heresy, and the destruction of the innocent. It was a story so vile, so utterly depraved, that it had to be true. Who could invent such things? The answer, of course, is a man in unimaginable pain, desperate to make it stop, telling his torturers exactly what they want to hear. The girdle, the magic belt that allowed him to become a wolf? It was the perfect supernatural explanation. It allowed the judges to sidestep the tricky theological question of whether a man could truly become a beast, a power supposedly reserved for God alone. No, Stump didn't change himself. The devil did it for him, using a magical artifact. It was a clean, simple, and utterly damning explanation. And so, on October 31, 1589, Peter Stump was made an example. His execution was not a quiet, somber affair. It was a public spectacle, a piece of state-sponsored theater designed to terrify the populace into obedience and piety. First, he was tied to a wheel. His flesh was torn from his bones in 10 separate places with red-hot pincers. Then, with a wooden axe, the executioner smashed his arms and legs, shattering the bones to prevent him from ever rising from the grave. While he was still alive, he was beheaded. His body was then burned on a pyre. But the horror didn't end there. His daughter and his mistress, convicted as accomplices, were burned alive at the same stake. And as a final gruesome warning, the authorities erected a pole in the town square. At its top, they mounted the very wheel used for his torture. And on top of the wheel, they placed the head of Peter Stump, alongside a wooden carving of a wolf. It was a monument to fear, a stark reminder of the beast that walks among men and the terrible price of dealing with the devil. The story of the Werewolf of Bedburg exploded across Europe. Thanks to the newly invented printing press, cheap pamphlets detailing his crimes and execution were translated into multiple languages and distributed far and wide. He became an overnight sensation, a real-life boogeyman. But Peter Stump was not an anomaly. He was a symptom of a much larger disease. His trial was just one of hundreds of so-called werewolf trials that swept across Europe from the 15th to the 17th century, a dark and often overlooked chapter of the infamous witch hunts. To understand how this could happen, you have to understand the world these people lived in. This was an age of profound anxiety. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of Europe, pitting neighbor against neighbor. Wars, famine, and the lingering shadow of the Black Death created a constant, low-humming sense of dread. The world felt like it was teetering on the brink of apocalypse. In times of chaos and uncertainty, people search for scapegoats. They look for a simple explanation for their suffering, a face to put on their fear. And for centuries, that face had been the witch. The werewolf was simply a new, more terrifying mask for the same old devil. The legal and theological framework was already in place. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published a century earlier, had laid out the legal justification for hunting, torturing, and executing those accused of witchcraft. It was a how-to guide for persecution. All the courts had to do was substitute the word werewolf for witch. The logic was identical. The accused had made a pact with Satan, renounced God, and in exchange received the power to shapeshift and prey upon the innocent. The werewolf wasn't just a man who turned into a wolf. He was a heretic, a soldier in the devil's army against God. And in a holy war, there are no rules of engagement. This wave of paranoia was particularly intense in France, Germany, and Switzerland. Accusations flew. A lone traveler, a reclusive woodsman, a neighbor with a grudge. Anyone could be next. Consider the case of the Gondilin family in the Jura Mountains of France in 1598. The whole family, a brother, a sister, and her 2 children, were accused of lycanthropy. It started when a young boy was found dead, his body savaged. His sister accused Pernette Gondilin of attacking him in the form of a wolf. Under torture, Pernette confessed, implicating her brother Pierre and her own son. They all told the court the same story. They would anoint themselves with a magical salve, transform into wolves, and attend demonic sabbaths in the woods. They were all executed. Or what about Gilles Garnier, the hermit of Saint Benoît? In 1572, he was accused of being a werewolf responsible for the disappearance of several children. He confessed under duress to hunting them in wolf form, strangling them, and carrying their flesh home to eat with his wife. He was burned at the stake. Over and over the pattern repeated. A rural community, a series of unexplained deaths or livestock killings, a climate of fear, and an outcast to blame. The confessions, always extracted through torture, are eerily similar. They speak of ointments, pacts, and a ravenous hunger for human flesh. Historians and psychologists today look back and see a perfect storm of social hysteria, religious fanaticism, and possibly unrecognized mental illness. Some have even suggested that the magical salves the accused confessed to using might have contained hallucinogenic compounds, causing them to believe they had transformed. But for the people at the time, the explanation was much simpler and far more terrifying. The wolves were real, and they were walking among them. But of all the werewolf trials that stained the history of Europe, none is more bizarre, more complex, or more disturbing than that of a man in 16th century France. This wasn't a case of a simple farmer or a reclusive hermit. This was a case that involved a serial killer, a court of law that refused to accept a supernatural explanation, and a final verdict that was, in some ways, more chilling than a death sentence. It's a story that forces us to ask a terrifying question. What do you do when the monster isn't a demon in disguise, but just a man? That question haunted the courts and villages of Europe for centuries. As the fires of the witch trials began to die down, a new, more unsettling idea began to take hold. The age of reason was dawning, and with it came a chilling proposition. Perhaps the monster wasn't an external force, a pact with the devil, or a curse from a vengeful sorcerer. Perhaps the monster was born from within. The most terrifying beasts, it turned out, could be forged in the quiet, dark crucible of the human mind. This brings us to one of the most pivotal and strangest cases in the history of lycanthropy, the trial of Jean Grenier in 1603. Grenier was a 13-year-old peasant boy from the south of France who wandered into a village and began telling a group of girls an astonishing story. He claimed he was a werewolf, and not just in his imagination. He boasted, with a disturbing lack of emotion, that he had attacked and eaten several children. He described in detail how another man had given him a wolfskin and a magical salve, and how, at night, he would transform into a ravenous beast and hunt. Naturally, the villagers were horrified. His story was disturbingly similar to other local reports of a wolf-like creature savaging livestock, and more terrifyingly, of children who had gone missing. Grenier was arrested and put on trial. On the surface, it looked like a repeat of the Peter Stump case. Here was a self-confessed werewolf, a monster responsible for heinous crimes. The public demanded fire and the stake. They wanted the demon cast out, the evil purged. But something different happened this time. The judge presiding over the case, a man named Pierre de Lanker, was no stranger to the supernatural. In fact, he was one of history's most infamous witch hunters, responsible for the deaths of hundreds. You would expect him to be the first to call for an execution. Yet, when he looked at the young, emaciated, and clearly troubled Jean Grenier, he saw something other than pure evil. He saw a broken child. Instead of accepting the boy's confession of witchcraft and demonic pacts at face value, the court ordered a medical examination. The physicians who assessed Grenier found no devil's marks, no physical signs of sorcery. What they found was a boy who was, in their words, suffering from insane melancholy and a perpetual delusion. They concluded that Jean Grenier wasn't a sorcerer who became a wolf. He was a boy who believed he was a wolf. This was a seismic shift. The court ruled that Grenier was not a criminal to be executed, but a patient to be treated. He was sentenced not to the pyre, but to life in a monastery, where he would be cared for. It was an act of unprecedented legal and medical mercy, but in that verdict lies a horror of a different kind. The horror of being trapped not by a curse, but by your own mind. The terror of a reality so fractured that the identity of a human being can be completely overwritten by that of a beast. This is the birth of our modern understanding of clinical lycanthropy. It's not a supernatural affliction. It's a rare and fascinating psychiatric syndrome. It's a delusional belief where an individual is utterly convinced they can transform, have transformed, or are, in fact, an animal. And it's not just wolves. Throughout medical history, there are documented cases of people believing they were dogs, cats, horses, even bees. The condition is known as zoanthropy. But the wolf, with its deep-seated cultural symbolism of primal ferocity and untamed nature, remains the most common and compelling form. So what is actually happening inside the brain of someone with clinical lycanthropy? It's often a symptom of a much larger underlying psychosis, like schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. Imagine your sense of self, that quiet, constant inner voice that tells you who you are. Now imagine that voice being drowned out, replaced by something else entirely. Neurologists who have studied these cases suggest it could be linked to malfunctions in areas of the brain that govern our body image and sense of physical self, like the parietal and prefrontal cortexes. In fMRI scans of patients experiencing these types of delusions, these regions of the brain can show bizarre activity, essentially redrawing the person's internal map of their own body. They might not just think they have claws, they might genuinely feel the sensation of their fingernails elongating. They might feel their facial structure shifting, their teeth sharpening, a phantom coat of fur sprouting across their skin. To them, the transformation is not a delusion. It is a physical, sensory reality. Their own brain is lying to them in the most profound way possible, betraying their very identity. This is where the myth and the medical reality become terrifyingly intertwined. Does the myth create the madness, or does the madness seek out the myth? It's likely a bit of both. A person experiencing a psychotic break, losing their grip on reality, is desperately trying to make sense of the terrifying changes happening within them. And our culture provides a powerful pre-written script, the werewolf. The ancient story gives a name and a shape to their internal chaos. The legend becomes a framework for their delusion, a way to explain the unexplainable feeling that a beast is tearing its way out from the inside. Jean Grenier, the boy who was sent to a monastery instead of the stake, lived there for 7 years. The monks who cared for him reported that he largely abandoned his werewolf persona, but remained deeply troubled. He walked on all fours, and his behavior was often erratic and animalistic. He died at the age of 20, a prisoner of his own mind. His case marks the moment the werewolf began its slow, strange migration from the dark forests of folklore into the even darker, unmapped territory of human consciousness. The monster was no longer simply a creature of the night, a physical threat you could fight with silver and steel. It was now an idea, a sickness of the soul. It was the terrifying possibility that the barrier between man and beast, between reason and instinct, is not a stone wall, but a fragile veil that can be torn apart by the glitches in our own neurochemistry. The horror was no longer about what a monster could do to your body, but what your own mind could do to you. It proved that the most inescapable prison is the one built from your own thoughts, the most terrifying monster, the one that wears your own face. We've dissected the monster born of demonic pacts, and the monster born of a broken mind. But there's a third type of werewolf, one that bridges the gap between the two. One that is neither a curse nor a delusion, but a terrifying quirk of biology. What happens when the body, not the mind, begins to betray its human form? When a real-world medical condition causes symptoms so shocking, so animalistic, that it convinces entire communities they are living next to a monster in the flesh. The line between myth and medicine is about to get much blurrier. To find the origin of the werewolf, we don't need to look in dusty tomes of forbidden lore, or in the shadows of a haunted forest. We need to look in a medical textbook. We need to look at our own fragile human biology, and how, on rare terrifying occasions, it can go wrong. Consider a condition known as congenital hypertrichosis. You've probably heard it called by its more common, and much crueler name, werewolf syndrome. It's a genetic mutation, an error in our code, that causes an abnormal, excessive amount of hair to grow over the body, not just on the head or the arms, everywhere. The face, the back, the hands. A thick, dark coat of hair that can obscure the human features beneath. Now, transport yourself back in time to the 16th century. You live in a small, superstitious village. You've heard the stories whispered around the fire of men who become beasts. One day, a traveling noble passes through, and in his entourage is a boy, no older than 10. The boy is treated not as a person but as a pet, a curiosity. And as you look at him, you see a human face, but it is covered almost completely in a dense mat of hair. His name was Petrus Gonsalves, and he was real. Born in Tenerife in 1537, Petrus was brought to the court of King Henry II of France. He wasn't seen as a boy with a medical condition. He was seen as a wild man, a specimen to be studied and displayed. They educated him, taught him Latin, dressed him in fine clothes, but he was never truly one of them. He was a living monster, a courtly plaything. In a bizarre and cruel social experiment, the Queen Regent, Catherine de' Medici, decided to see if a wild man could be tamed by love. She arranged a marriage for him to a beautiful young woman, also named Catherine. Imagine the terror and confusion of that young bride, being told you are to marry a monster from the woods. Yet, by all accounts, their marriage was a successful one. They had children, several of whom inherited their father's condition. The Gonsalves family became a traveling spectacle across Europe, painted by artists, gawked at by nobles. They were a family, but to the world they were a pack. Living proof that the line between man and beast was horrifyingly thin. In an age of superstition, without any understanding of genetics, what other conclusion could be drawn? You see a man like Petrus Gonsalves or one of his children, and you don't see a genetic anomaly. You see a curse. You see the physical manifestation of the werewolf legend. The human form corrupted and twisted into something animalistic. It's not a transformation under the full moon. It's a permanent, living nightmare. But what if the changes were more than skin deep? What if the affliction came not from the skin, but from the blood itself? There is a group of rare blood disorders called porphyria. The body fails to produce heme, a critical component of hemoglobin, correctly. This leads to a buildup of chemicals called porphyrins, and the symptoms are the stuff of Gothic horror. One of the most devastating symptoms is extreme photosensitivity. Sunlight becomes an enemy. It causes painful, blistering lesions on the skin. Over time, repeated exposure can cause horrific disfigurement. The nose, the ears, the eyelids can be eroded away, giving the face a mutilated, animal-like appearance. The gums can recede, making the teeth appear longer, more like fangs. And to make matters worse, those same porphyrins can stain the teeth a reddish brown, as if stained with old blood. So now picture the victim of severe, untreated porphyria. They can only come out at night, to avoid the agonizing burn of the sun. Their face is disfigured, their teeth look like bloody fangs. They might even suffer from the psychological symptoms that can accompany the disease: anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations. To a medieval villager, this isn't a person with a blood disorder. This is a creature of the night, a monster that shuns the day, its teeth stained from its last victim, its mind lost to a primal madness. It's not a werewolf, but it's terrifyingly close. Yet even these shocking physical ailments pale in comparison to the horror of a disease that attacks the mind and rewrites the very definition of what it means to be human. A disease that is, in fact, transmitted by the bite of an animal. Rabies. The word itself conjures images of madness and foaming mouths. It is one of the deadliest viruses known to man. Once symptoms appear, it is nearly 100% fatal. And its progression is a near-perfect blueprint for a werewolf transformation. It begins, as the legends dictate, with a bite. A wolf, a dog, a bat. The virus lies dormant, incubating for weeks, sometimes months. Then the first signs emerge: fever, headache, a strange tingling at the site of the bite. This is the calm before the storm. The virus is traveling, making its way along the nerves to the brain. And when it arrives, all hell breaks loose. The victim becomes agitated, aggressive, confused. Their personality changes completely. They are seized by uncontrollable excitement and terror. This is the furious stage of rabies. They experience hydrophobia, a fear of water. Not because they are afraid of water itself, but because the act of swallowing causes intensely painful spasms of the throat muscles. Even the sight or sound of water can trigger these convulsions. They begin to drool, to foam at the mouth, unable to swallow their own saliva. Their voice changes. The spasms in their larynx and pharynx can cause them to emit strange guttural sounds. Hoarse cries, growls. They may lash out, biting, scratching, driven by a virus that has hijacked their brain with one single, overriding command: spread. The human is gone. In their place is a terrified, aggressive animal, trapped in a human body, driven by pure viral insanity. Think of it. A man from your village is bitten by a wolf while tending his flock. Weeks later, he falls ill. He becomes violent, paranoid. He shuns water. He foams at the mouth and makes sounds that are not human. He tries to bite his own family. You are not witnessing a viral infection of the central nervous system. You are witnessing the curse take hold. You are watching a man become a beast right before your very eyes. The legend isn't a story anymore. It's a public health crisis. Hypertrichosis gave the werewolf its hairy appearance. Porphyria gave it fangs and a fear of the sun. Rabies gave it the bite, the madness, the animalistic rage. These are the medical building blocks of our monster. But there is one final piece. One condition more chilling than all the others because it requires no physical change at all. The transformation is entirely in the mind. It's called clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric syndrome where a person suffers from the delusion that they can transform, or have already transformed, into an animal. Most commonly, a wolf. They don't just think it. They feel it. They report feeling their bones shifting, their skin stretching, hair sprouting from their pores. They will crawl on all fours, howl, and insist on eating raw meat. In their mind, the transformation is not a delusion. It is a reality. The body may be human, but the mind is already howling at the moon. These diseases, these horrifying glitches in our own biology and psychology, could explain the sightings, the fear, the stories passed down through generations. They show us how a simple farmer could see his neighbor, afflicted and suffering, and see a monster instead. But they don't explain the confessions. They don't explain why, for a period of over 200 years, hundreds of people, under oath and facing certain death, swore to the courts of Europe that they were werewolves, that they had made pacts with the devil, and on the full moon, they became beasts and murdered men, women, and children. To understand that, we must step out of the medical tent and into the courtroom, where the sentence for lycanthropy was always death. The year is 1589. The place, a small terrified town near Cologne, Germany. In the center of the courtroom, chained and broken, is a man named Peter Stump. To the judges, to the jury, to every fearful villager crammed into the gallery, he is not a man. He is a monster. A prolific serial killer, a cannibal, an incestuous deviant who for over 2 decades had terrorized the countryside in the form of a ravenous wolf. This was not a trial to determine guilt or innocence. It was a ritual, a public exorcism of a community's deepest fears. The evidence against Stump was non-existent by modern standards. There were no witnesses who saw him transform, no physical proof linking him to the dozens of murders. All they had was a confession, and in the 16th century, a confession was the queen of proofs, no matter how it was obtained. Peter Stump was stretched upon the rack, a device designed to dislocate every joint in a human body. Thumbscrews crushed his fingers, and hot pincers were prepared to tear at his flesh. Under this unimaginable agony, Stump's silence broke. He began to talk, and the story he told was exactly the one his accusers wanted to hear. It was a story of pure, unadulterated evil. He confessed that as a boy of 12, he had begun to practice black magic. Deep in the woods, he had summoned the devil himself. The Prince of Darkness appeared before him and offered Stump a deal. He could have anything his heart desired: wealth, women, power, but in return he had to renounce God and dedicate his soul to hell. Stump agreed. As a token of their pact, the devil gave him a magical girdle, a belt woven from wolf pelt. When he wore it, he told the court he was transformed. His body would contort, his nails would sharpen into claws, his teeth would elongate into fangs. He became, in his own words, the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like brands of fire. For the next 25 years, he claimed, he lived a monstrous double life. By day, he was Peter Stump, a seemingly ordinary farmer. But by night, under the spell of the girdle, he was a beast driven by an insatiable hunger for human blood. He confessed to slaughtering livestock, goats, lambs, and sheep, tearing them apart and devouring their raw entrails. But farm animals could not satisfy his demonic craving. He moved on to people. He recounted in excruciating detail the murders of 13 young children. He described how he would stalk them in the fields, overpower them, and tear open their throats with his teeth, drinking their warm blood as it gushed from their veins. He even confessed to the most unthinkable act of all, the murder of his own son. He claimed he had bashed the boy's head in, ripped out his brain, and eaten it. The courtroom listened, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. This was it. This was the explanation for all the missing children, for the mutilated livestock, for the gnawing fear that had haunted their village for a generation. It wasn't a stray wolf. It wasn't bandits. It was the devil, walking among them in the skin of their neighbor. His confession didn't stop at murder. He admitted to a long-standing incestuous relationship with his daughter, who he said had been conceived with the help of a succubus, a female demon. He also implicated his mistress, claiming she was his accomplice, fully aware of his nightly transformations and often joining him on his hunts. With the confession secured, the verdict was a formality. Peter Stump, his daughter, and his mistress were all found guilty. The sentence was not merely death. It was to be a spectacle of suffering, a warning to any who might dare to follow his path. On October 31, 1589, Peter Stump was led to the place of execution. First, he was bound to a large wheel. Executioners used red-hot pincers to tear 10 separate strips of flesh from his arms and legs. Then, with a heavy wooden mallet, they systematically broke every bone in his limbs. While still alive, gasping and shattered, he was beheaded. His body was then burned on a pyre. His daughter and mistress were forced to watch his entire ordeal before they too were burned alive at the stake as convicted witches. But the town's vengeance wasn't finished. As a final chilling monument to their terror, They erected a pole in the center of the execution ground. On top, they mounted the very wheel used to break Stump's body. And on that wheel, they placed an effigy of a wolf. And next to it, they mounted the severed, decomposing head of Peter Stump himself, a grim warning that stood for years. The story of the Werewolf of Bedburg might have remained a local horror story, but a pamphlet was printed, detailing every lurid accusation, every moment of his confession and execution. It was translated into English and spread across Europe like wildfire. It became a sensation, a true crime bestseller of its day, and it cemented a terrifying new template in the public mind. The werewolf was no longer just a figure from folklore, a cursed man to be pitied. He was now a diabolical sorcerer, a devil worshipper, a willing servant of evil who chose his monstrous fate. Peter Stump's trial demonstrates a critical shift. The belief in werewolves was merging with the hysteria of the great European witch hunts. The legal and religious authorities of the time had a framework for dealing with witches, accusation, torture, confession, and execution. They simply applied that same brutal logic to werewolves. But looking back with modern eyes, we see a different story. We see a man, likely suffering from a mental illness or perhaps just an outcast, who became the scapegoat for a community's collective anxiety. We see a legal system that valued confession above all else, and was willing to inflict inhuman cruelty to obtain it. A man under that kind of torture would confess to anything. He would confess to being a wolf. He would confess to eating his own son. He would confess to meeting the devil just to make the pain stop. Peter Stump was almost certainly not a werewolf. He was a victim of a time when the lines between man, monster, and God were drawn in blood. His trial was not an isolated event. Across France, Switzerland, and Germany, the pyres were being lit for others accused of the same impossible crime. Men like Gilles Garnier, the werewolf of Dole, a hermit who confessed under torture to hunting and eating children in the form of a wolf, and the Gondilin family in the Jura Mountains, an entire family of outcasts accused of lycanthropy and put to death. These trials raise a disturbing question. Who was the real monster? The man accused of turning into a beast, or the society so terrified of the dark that it was willing to become monstrous itself to fight it? The werewolf of folklore was a creature of supernatural curse, but the werewolf of the 16th and 17th centuries was a creation of something far more terrestrial and far more terrifying: human fear. And as this fear spread, the hunt for werewolves would evolve, becoming more systematic, more widespread, and even more deadly. This new, systematic approach to hunting monsters wasn't born in a vacuum. It had a blueprint, a terrifying instruction manual for turning paranoia into policy. While it was famously written to persecute witches, its dark logic bled into every corner of the supernatural panic. The book was called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, and it provided the legal and theological framework for identifying, prosecuting, and annihilating those deemed servants of the devil. And in an age where the line between a witch and a werewolf was hopelessly blurred, this book became a death sentence for both. It laid out a chillingly logical step-by-step process. First, the accusation. This required little more than a neighbor's suspicion, a whispered rumor of someone seen near the woods at night, or a person who was simply an outsider, reclusive, strange, or physically different. Once the accusation was made, the full weight of the local authorities would descend. The second step was the search for evidence. Just as witch hunters searched for a devil's mark, a spot on the body insensitive to pain, werewolf hunters looked for similar signs. Unusually thick hair on the palms of the hands, a unibrow, or a scar from an animal trap could all be twisted into proof of a lycanthropic nature. They would look for wolf pelts in the home, or strange ointments made of bizarre ingredients, claiming these were the tools of transformation. But this physical evidence was rarely enough. The system required the ultimate proof, a confession. And to get that confession, they turned to the third and most brutal step: torture. The rack, the thumbscrew, the iron boot. These were not just instruments of pain, but tools of narrative creation. Under unimaginable agony, the accused would not only admit to being a werewolf, but would be forced to elaborate, to fill in the details the inquisitors wanted to hear. They would confess to pacts with Satan, to receiving a magical belt or a special salve that allowed them to change form. They would be forced to recount, in graphic detail, the blasphemous midnight rituals, the cannibalistic feasts on the flesh of children, the unholy alliance with the wolves of the forest. The confession was not a discovery of truth. It was a performance, scripted by the torturer and spoken by the victim, designed to confirm the deepest fears of the community. With the forced confession secured, the final step was a mere formality: the public trial and execution. The trial was a spectacle, a piece of theater designed to reinforce the power of the church and state. The confession, often repeated by a broken and dying prisoner, served as a grim warning to the populace. The execution was equally symbolic, almost always by fire. Burning the body was believed to be the only way to purify the soul, and, more importantly, to ensure the monster could never rise again. This horrifying legal machine was not just a theoretical model. It was put into practice across Europe, and nowhere is its brutal efficiency more evident than in the case of Peter Stump, the man who would become known as the Werewolf of Bedburg. In 1589, in a small town near Cologne, Germany, a wave of savage attacks had terrified the countryside. Livestock were being torn apart, and worse, children were disappearing. The culprit was believed to be an unnaturally large and cunning wolf that evaded all traps and hunters. Fear reached a fever pitch until one day, a group of hunters finally cornered the beast. As they closed in with their dogs and spears, the story goes that the wolfish form shimmered and twisted, and where the beast had stood, there was now a man, a local farmer named Peter Stump. Stump was immediately put to the question. Under torture, he delivered a confession so lurid, so detailed, that it became the archetypal werewolf story for centuries to come. He claimed that as a boy, he had made a pact with the devil. In exchange for his soul, the devil gave him a magical belt made of wolf pelt, which when worn would instantly transform him into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like brands of fire. For 25 years, he claimed, he had stalked the fields of Bedburg in this form. He confessed to killing and eating goats, sheep and lambs. But then his confession turned darker. He admitted to devouring 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and his own son, whose brains he claimed to have eaten raw from his skull. The confession was a masterpiece of terror, perfectly tailored to the fears of the time. It combined lycanthropy, Satanism, cannibalism, and incest. It was everything the Malleus Maleficarum warned about, brought to life in a single monstrous figure. The town of Bedburg needed a monster to blame for its suffering, and Peter Stump, under the agony of the rack, gave them the most terrifying monster imaginable. His fate was sealed. On October 31, 1589, Peter Stump was subjected to one of the most brutal executions ever recorded. He was tied to a wheel, and with red-hot pincers, the flesh was torn from his bones 10 times. His arms and legs were broken with the back of an axe to prevent him from ever returning from the grave. Finally, while still alive, he was beheaded. His body was burned on a pyre. As a final gruesome warning, his head was mounted on a post, surrounded by the heads of 16 of his supposed victims, and at the very top, the wheel of his execution and the likeness of a wolf were displayed for all to see. The case of Peter Stump became a sensation. Pamphlets detailing his crimes were printed and distributed across Europe, cementing the image of the satanic, man-eating werewolf in the public consciousness. But not every case was so clear-cut, or so brutally concluded. Just a few years later, in 1603 in the south of France, a very different kind of werewolf appeared. His name was Jean Grenier. He wasn't a respected farmer like Stump. He was a 13-year-old beggar, a feral child who lived on the margins of society. When a young girl went missing, suspicion fell on Grenier. When confronted, he didn't need to be tortured. He confessed freely, almost proudly. He told the authorities that he, too, had made a pact with a dark entity he called the Lord of the Forest. This entity had given him a wolf skin and a special ointment. At night, he claimed, he would transform and run with a pack of 9 other werewolves, hunting and attacking people. He boasted of having killed and eaten several children. His story was wild, inconsistent, and filled with the lonely fantasies of a disturbed and neglected boy. He was clearly not the cunning, demonic monster that Peter Stump was made out to be. He was a child, likely suffering from severe mental illness and malnutrition, weaving a story to gain attention and a sense of power in a world that had given him none. The court was faced with a dilemma. Here was a self-proclaimed werewolf, a child cannibal by his own admission. The old laws, the laws that condemned Peter Stump, demanded he be burned at the stake. But the judge, a man named Pierre de Lanker, saw something different. He saw not a monster but a melancholy boy. an imbecile whose mind was filled with delusions. The court ultimately rejected the idea of a physical transformation. They ruled that Jean Grenier was not a werewolf, but a victim of lycanthropy, a mental delusion, a sickness of the mind that made him believe he was a wolf. Instead of being executed, he was sentenced to life in a monastery, to be cared for and prayed for. The case of Jean Grenier marks a subtle but profound turning point. For perhaps the first time, the legal system blinked. It chose a medical diagnosis over a supernatural one. The werewolf was beginning to move out of the forest and into the human mind. The hunt, however, was far from over. The fear was too deep, the scapegoat too convenient. The werewolf trials were more than just a hunt for monsters. They were a form of social control. In a time of plague, famine, and religious war, the werewolf provided a simple answer to a complex question. Why are we suffering? Because there are monsters among us. Pointing a finger at a neighbor, an outcast, a lonely old woman, or a disturbed young boy, was a way to impose order on a chaotic world. It was a way to purify the community by sacrificing its most vulnerable members. The werewolf wasn't just a beast of the full moon. It was a political tool, a weapon of social terror, and the fires of its persecution were burning brighter than ever before. But even as the flames reached their peak, the first whispers of a new age were on the wind, an age of reason and science that would challenge the very foundations of this dark superstition. The monster's midnight reign was facing a new and unexpected threat: the dawn. The dawn broke not with sunlight but with logic. Across Europe, a profound shift was underway. The flickering candlelight of superstition that had illuminated the werewolf for centuries was being challenged by the bright, unwavering glare of the Enlightenment. Philosophers, physicians, and scientists began to look at the world not as a stage for divine and demonic battles, but as a complex machine governed by natural laws, laws that could be understood, tested, and proven. And in this new rational world, there was simply no room for a man who could physically transform into a wolf. The werewolf was put on trial once more, but this time the courtroom was the laboratory, the lecture hall, the anatomy theater. The judges were men of medicine and reason, and the evidence they demanded was not a coerced confession, but observable physical proof. For the first time, the question wasn't, is this person guilty of being a werewolf? But rather, what is actually happening to this person? Suddenly, old terrors were given new names. Consider the condition of hypertrichosis, a rare genetic disorder that causes excessive hair growth all over the body. Imagine a small, isolated village in the 16th century. A child is born covered in thick, dark hair. As they grow, the hair covers their face, their hands, their entire body. They are ostracized, feared. Their features appear coarse, almost animalistic. To a mind steeped in folklore and fear, what other explanation could there be? This was not a medical anomaly. This was a mark of the beast, a physical manifestation of a cursed soul. Science offered a different, less terrifying, but perhaps more tragic explanation. It wasn't a monster, but a person with a painful and misunderstood condition. Then there was rabies, the hydrophobia, the fear of water. Think of the symptoms: agitation, delirium, confusion, aggression. The victim becomes hypersensitive to light and sound. In the final horrific stages, muscle spasms contort the face into a grotesque snarl. The throat seizes up, producing guttural groans and foam saliva. And, most terrifyingly, the disease is transmitted by a bite, often the bite of a wild animal like a wolf. To a pre-scientific society, a person bitten by a wolf who then develops these symptoms, becoming violent, animal-like, and driven to bite others, was not suffering from a viral infection of the nervous system. They were suffering from the wolf's curse. The poison wasn't a virus. It was a demonic contagion, passing from beast to man. Scholars also began to look at the food supply. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, was a common contaminant in damp climates. When ingested, it could cause a condition known as ergotism, leading to horrifying symptoms: convulsions, painful muscle spasms, and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Entire communities, eating from the same contaminated grain supply, could experience a shared madness, a collective psychosis. They might see their neighbors as demons, their livestock as monsters, or themselves as ravening beasts. The werewolf wasn't in the woods. It was in their daily bread, a fungal poison that warped the mind and turned a village upon itself. As these rational explanations gained traction, the legal system began to change. The very concept of justice was being reforged in the fires of reason. Judges and magistrates, increasingly educated in these new scientific ideas, grew skeptical of supernatural claims. A confession extracted under the agony of the rack was no longer seen as divine truth, but as the desperate cries of a broken human being. Spectral evidence, the testimony that a victim's spirit had accused someone, was thrown out of court. To convict someone of murder, you needed a body, a weapon, a motive. To convict them of being a werewolf, what did you have? The fearful gossip of neighbors? The ravings of a supposed victim? It was no longer enough. The werewolf, once a terrifying figure in the courtroom, was being dismissed for lack of evidence. But the beast did not simply vanish. It is not so easy to kill a monster that lives in the deepest parts of the human psyche. As science explained away the physical werewolf, it inadvertently uncovered something else, something almost as strange, the werewolf of the mind. Physicians began documenting cases of what they termed clinical lycanthropy. This was not a physical transformation, but a profound psychological delusion. Patients would be brought to asylums, utterly convinced that they were wolves. They would eschew human contact, prefer to crawl on all fours and howl at the moon. They would complain of their skin feeling like fur, their teeth elongating into fangs. One of the most famous cases was that of a Spanish man in the 19th century who was convinced he had transformed. He was found living naked in the wilderness, and when questioned, he insisted he was a wolf, detailing his hunts and the taste of raw flesh. He wasn't lying, not in his own mind. The experience was utterly real to him. For the first time, the focus shifted from the supernatural curse to the fragile nature of human sanity. The werewolf was no longer a demon possessing a body, but a delusion possessing a mind. It was a symptom of a deeper madness, a fractured identity where the civilized self was consumed by a primal, animalistic alter ego. This was the birth of the psychological werewolf, a monster born not of magic, but of trauma, psychosis, and the dark, untamed wilderness of the human brain. And so, the creature was driven into a new kind of exile. Evicted from the courtrooms and the medical journals as a physical reality, it took refuge in the last place it could not be dissected or disproven, the imagination. The werewolf retreated from the realm of fact into the realm of folklore. It became a story, a myth, a fairy tale. It was the big bad wolf who preyed on Little Red Riding Hood, a cautionary tale for children who strayed from the path. It was the subject of local legends, the ghost stories whispered around a winter fire, a shadow of its former terrifying self. Scholars and storytellers like the Brothers Grimm in Germany traveled the countryside, collecting these oral traditions. They were preserving a dying world, writing down the tales the old folk told, tales of witches and goblins, and of course of werewolves. In doing so, they were transforming the creature once again. It was no longer a matter of public record or theological debate. It was now literature. It was a character, an archetype, a potent symbol of humanity's duality. The civilized man and the savage beast locked in an eternal struggle within a single soul. The Age of Reason, in its quest to banish the shadows, had ironically given the greatest shadow of all a permanent home. By explaining it away, science had made the werewolf safe to explore. It was no longer a heretic to be burned or a madman to be locked away. It was a concept, a metaphor, a thrilling and terrible idea. The monster had been defeated on the physical plane only to be reborn on the psychological and cultural one. Science had dissected the body and found no wolf, but in doing so, it had unleashed the idea of the wolf from the chains of superstition. And this idea, now free and untethered from reality, was about to find new storytellers, new artists, and new mediums that would make it more powerful, more seductive, and more terrifying than ever before. The rational world had tried to bury the werewolf, but it had only planted a seed. And in the fertile soil of the coming romantic era, that seed was about to grow into a dark and magnificent forest. The forest of the romantic imagination was a place of sublime terror and breathtaking beauty. It was a place where civilization's grip was weakest, and where the true, untamed heart of nature and of man could be revealed. As the apathetic certainty of the Enlightenment gave way to a new age of passionate emotion, introspection, and a fascination with the macabre, the werewolf found its perfect hunting ground. The world was changing at a dizzying pace. The Industrial Revolution was churning, forging a new society of steam, iron, and rigid social order. Cities swelled, blotting out the stars with smoke, and people were increasingly taught to suppress their instincts, to be polite, controlled, and productive members of a great machine. But what happened to the passions that were chained? What became of the primal urges that were locked away in the dark corners of the Victorian mind? They festered, they grew, and they found their perfect avatar in the werewolf. This was no longer just a village pest or a satanic fiend. The 19th century werewolf became a symbol for the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of casting off the shackles of society. It was the beast within the gentleman, the scream behind the polite smile, the violent, passionate idea lurking beneath the rational ego. The werewolf was the explosive consequence of repression. It was the monster that society itself was creating. And this new, more complex monster first bared its fangs in the pages of Gothic literature. In 1839, the novelist Frederick Marryat published a short story that would forever change the werewolf's DNA, The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains. Here, the werewolf wasn't a hairy peasant from a backwater village. It was a beautiful, seductive, and aristocratic woman named Christina. She was the monster disguised as the ideal. She moved through high society, a vision of elegance and grace, while hiding a terrible predatory secret. The story features a band of brothers, one of whom falls for her charms, dismissing the dark local legends. The tale is a masterclass in suspense, culminating in a horrifying reveal. The beautiful bride is the very beast that has been slaughtering livestock and terrorizing the countryside. This was a revolutionary concept. The werewolf could now be anyone. It could be the person you love most, the person you trust implicitly. The monster was no longer out there in the woods. It was in your home, in your bed. The line between human and beast, love and predation, had been irrevocably blurred. But if Marryat gave the werewolf a sophisticated new mask, it was another writer who gave it a tormented soul. His name was George W. Reynolds, a master of the penny dreadful. These were cheap, serialized novels, the 19th century equivalent of a blockbuster television series, devoured by a mass audience hungry for sensation and melodrama. And in 1846, Reynolds unleashed his masterpiece, Wagner the Werewolf. This was the story that truly forged the modern werewolf archetype. It tells the tale of Fernand Wagner, an old, impoverished shepherd who, in a moment of despair, makes a Faustian bargain with the devil. In exchange for eternal youth, wealth, and knowledge, he must serve evil, and once a month, on the night of the full moon, he is cursed to become a ravenous wolf. For the first time on a grand scale, the werewolf was not a willing monster, but a tragic, cursed protagonist. Wagner is horrified by his transformation. He doesn't want to kill. He spends his immortal life desperately searching for redemption, for a way to break the curse that forces him to commit unspeakable acts. He is a good man trapped inside a monster's skin, tormented by the memories of the blood he has spilled. This was the birth of the sympathetic werewolf. The creature was now a victim of its own condition, a walking embodiment of an internal war. Readers were no longer just scared of the werewolf. They felt pity for it, they understood its agony. Reynolds had tapped into a profound human fear. The fear of losing control, of being forced by some dark, internal power to become the worst version of yourself. This internal struggle resonated deeply in an age that was becoming obsessed with the inner workings of the human mind. While writers were exploring the werewolf as a supernatural curse, a new breed of thinker, the early psychologist, was beginning to explore it as a malady of the brain. The term clinical lycanthropy gained traction, describing a rare delusion where a person genuinely believes they are transforming into an animal. They didn't grow fur or fangs, of course, but their minds made the terror real. Doctors and alienists of the day documented cases of patients who would get on all fours, howl at the moon, and claim to have a craving for raw meat. Was this madness? A symptom of rabies or schizophrenia? Or was it, perhaps, a psychological echo of a very old and very persistent myth? The werewolf now existed in a fascinating limbo, caught between two worlds. It was a supernatural monster stalking the pages of Gothic horror, and it was a clinical delusion being studied in the sterile wards of mental asylums. It was a creature of both superstition and science, folklore and psychology. This tension, the question of whether the beast is a literal demon from without or a psychological demon from within, became the central conflict of the werewolf story. Is it a curse, or is it a disease? And is there really a difference? This obsession with the divide itself reached its absolute zenith in 1886 with the publication of a story that, while not about a werewolf, is arguably the most important werewolf story ever written, Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Stevenson's novella crystallized the theme that had been haunting the 19th century. Dr. Henry Jekyll, a respected, brilliant scientist, is a man deeply aware of the profound duplicity of life. He knows that within him, as within all of us, there is a constant battle between the good, civilized self and the base, primal animal. His potion doesn't summon an external demon. It simply unleashes what was already there. Edward Hyde is the pure, distilled essence of Jekyll's own repressed desires, his anger, his lust, his violence. He is the beast within, given form and freedom. The story of Jekyll and Hyde is the werewolf stripped of its fur and fangs, laid bare to its psychological core. It is the ultimate expression of the Victorian gentleman's terror of his own inner nature. It proves that you don't need a gypsy's curse or a deal with the devil to become a monster. You just need to lose control. The monster is not an invasion. It is a revelation. And with that terrifying idea, the 19th century had perfected its monster. It had taken the medieval beast and given it a tormented soul, a sophisticated mind, and a deep psychological resonance. The werewolf was no longer just a story told around a fire. It was a dark mirror, reflecting the anxieties of a modern age. The stage was now set. The character was fully formed, a tragic, complex figure, torn between two natures. All it needed was a new kind of magic to bring it to life. A new medium that could project this nightmare not just into the mind's eye, but onto a vast flickering screen for the whole world to see. A silver screen. The flickering light of the projector was a new kind of campfire, and the stories it told were a new kind of myth. In the dark, cavernous dream palaces of the early 20th century, audiences were primed for monsters. They'd already seen vampires rise from their coffins and reanimated corpses lumber off their slabs. The werewolf, a creature born of shadow and folklore, was a natural fit for this new medium of light and shadow. The very first attempt to capture the beast on celluloid is now lost to time. A ghost in the cinematic machine. In 1913, a silent film simply titled The Werewolf told the story of a Navajo woman who, believing she is a shapeshifter, transforms to hunt down the white settlers who have wronged her people. It was a fascinating, uniquely American take on the legend, tying the transformation not to a European curse, but to indigenous magic and righteous vengeance. But like so many films of its era, the nitrate prints have long since crumbled to dust, leaving only its legend behind. For years, the werewolf remained a phantom on the periphery of horror cinema, a creature of rumor and potential. Then came the age of the universal monsters. In a studio that became a veritable Mount Olympus for things that go bump in the night, the stage was set for the werewolf to finally take its place in the pantheon. And in 1941, it did, in a film that would do more to define the creature for the next century than 1,000 years of folklore combined. That film was The Wolf Man. It's almost impossible to overstate its importance. The Wolf Man was the crucible in which the modern werewolf was forged. Before it, the lore was a scattered mess of regional tales and contradictory superstitions. After it, the rules were set in stone. The film's screenwriter, Kurt Siodmak, a Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany, later admitted that he drew upon his own experiences of seeing good people become monsters to craft the story. He essentially invented the modern werewolf mythos from whole cloth, weaving together disparate threads and adding his own iconic contributions. The film gave us Larry Talbot, played with a heartbreaking melancholy by Lon Chaney Jr. Talbot is not a villain. He is the ultimate victim. An ordinary, decent man who returns to his ancestral home in Wales, tries to do the right thing, and for his troubles is bitten by a wolf while defending a woman. The curse that follows is not a source of power, but of profound, soul-crushing tragedy. He is trapped, a prisoner in his own body, horrified by the beast he is forced to become. This sympathetic portrayal was key. The fear wasn't just about what the monster could do to you. It was about the terror of becoming the monster yourself, of losing control and destroying everything you love. Siodmak also penned the immortal piece of doggerel that became the werewolf's gospel. Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. This simple, haunting rhyme codified the curse. It wasn't about sin or evil. It could happen to anyone, even the pure in heart. The film cemented the lore we now take for granted. The bite is what passes the curse along, a viral contagion. The full moon is the inescapable trigger. The pentagram appears on the palm of the next victim, a mark of the beast. And most critically, it established the creature's one great weakness: silver. Not just any weapon could stop it. It required a silver bullet, or in the film's climax, a silver-headed cane, wielded by the werewolf's own unknowing father. It's a twist of Greek tragedy, a story of damnation, fate, and patricide. And then there was the transformation itself. Makeup artist Jack Pierce, the genius who had already created Frankenstein's monster and the mummy, crafted the iconic look. Using yak hair, a rubber snout, and hours of painstaking application, he created a creature that was the perfect hybrid of man and beast. It walked on two legs, wore a tattered shirt and trousers, but possessed the fangs, claws, and feral face of a wolf. This bipedal monster, the Wolf Man, became the definitive image of a werewolf for generations. The transformation was achieved through a series of dissolves, a slow magical fade from man to monster. It was revolutionary for its time, but it was a gentle transformation, a cinematic sleight of hand that shielded the audience from the true biological horror of such a change. For the next few decades, this was the werewolf. Larry Talbot returned again and again in sequels, battling Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and even the comedy duo Abbott and Costello. The character became a beloved fixture of the Monster Mash B-movie circuit, but the tragic horror of the original was often diluted. The werewolf was a known quantity, a reliable scare, but the fangs had lost some of their bite. Then came 1981. 40 years after Larry Talbot first howled, two films were released that ripped the old werewolf apart and rebuilt it into something new, something terrifyingly visceral. It was a werewolf renaissance, fueled by a revolution in practical special effects. The transformation was no longer a gentle dissolve. It became the main event, a showcase of gruesome, explicit body horror. The first was John Landis's An American Werewolf in London. The film masterfully blended genuine, gut-wrenching horror with sharp, dark comedy. But its centerpiece, the reason it is still talked about in reverent tones today, is the transformation sequence. Special effects wizard Rick Baker, a protege of Jack Pierce himself, did what no one had ever done before. He showed the change in real time under bright lights with no cutaways. The audience watched as the protagonist David's body betrayed him in the most agonizing way imaginable. We saw hands elongating, the spine cracking and reshaping, the face stretching into a lupin snout. It wasn't magic, it was a biological nightmare. You felt the pain of every stretched sinew and every broken bone. Baker's groundbreaking work won him the first ever Academy Award for Best Makeup, and rightfully so. He had created a new kind of monster, a massive four-legged killing machine, a true predator that stalked the streets of London. Released the very same year was Joe Dante's The Howling. With effects by a young Rob Bottin, it pushed the boundaries in its own way, featuring another show-stopping, skin-bubbling, flesh-morphing transformation. But The Howling also expanded the lore, presenting werewolves not as lone, cursed individuals, but as a hidden society, a colony of shapeshifters fully aware and in control of their abilities, who saw their condition not as a curse, but as a superior form of existence. The contrast between the 1940s and the 1980s werewolf is stark. The Wolf Man was a tragic figure, a symbol of the beast within, the good man struggling with a dark nature he couldn't control. His horror was psychological. The werewolves of 1981 were engines of biological horror. The fear they inspired was physical, primal. The focus shifted from the torment of the soul to the agony of the flesh. These new monsters were a reflection of a new era's anxieties. If Larry Talbot represented a post-war fear of the good man forced to do monstrous things, the 80s beasts, with their focus on bodily mutation and uncontrollable change, tapped into contemporary fears of disease, bodily violation, and science run amok. The cinema had taken a creature of folklore and given it a definitive form, a set of rules, and a face. It took the abstract horror of a man becoming a wolf and made it tangible, first as a tragic figure cloaked in shadow and fog, and then as a hyper-realistic spectacle of tearing flesh and cracking bone. The silver screen was the werewolf's greatest amplifier, projecting the nightmare onto a canvas larger than life. And with each new generation of filmmakers, the beast would be reinvented, reinterpreted, and reborn. The evolution was far from over. The wolf had proven its adaptability, and it was about to find new hunting grounds, leaping from the big screen into novels, video games, and television, where its story would become even more complex, transforming from a simple monster into a symbol, a hero, a romantic lead, and a metaphor for the untamed wilderness in us all. The werewolf of the 21st century is a creature of profound complexity. no longer just a monster to be slain, but a protagonist to be understood. The horror is no longer external, a beast lurking in the woods. The horror is internal. The struggle is not one of survival against a predator, but a battle for one's own soul. In series like Teen Wolf, the curse becomes a metaphor for the terrifying, uncontrollable changes of adolescence. In the world of Harry Potter, Remus Lupin's lycanthropy isn't a source of evil power, but a shameful, debilitating illness that makes him an outcast. The wolf is not something he embraces. It's a part of him he despises and fears, a monthly ordeal of agony and isolation. This shift reveals the true, enduring power of the werewolf myth. It has become the ultimate symbol for our own duality, for the beast that resides within every single one of us. It is a perfect, terrifying embodiment of what the psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow self. The shadow is the part of our unconscious mind composed of repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, and instincts. It's the side of ourselves we try to hide, to tame, to civilize. It's the envy, the greed, the rage, the lust, all the primal urges that society tells us to suppress. We spend our lives keeping this shadow locked away, pretending it isn't there. But then comes the full moon. In the lore, the full moon is the catalyst, the irresistible force that pulls the beast to the surface. Psychologically, it represents any trigger in our own lives that causes us to lose control. It could be a moment of extreme stress, a deep-seated fear, a flash of uncontrollable anger. It is the moment the mask of civilization slips, and the shadow, the inner wolf, breaks free from its cage. The transformation is painful, a tearing of flesh and a splintering of bone, because it represents the violent internal conflict between our rational, human self and our primal, animal nature. The werewolf's rampage is not born of malice, but of pure, untamed instinct. It is the shadow self, unleashed without the guidance of the conscious mind. This is why the modern werewolf story resonates so deeply. It's not about a man turning into a wolf, it's about us. It's about our fear of what we are capable of when our inhibitions are stripped away. Who among us hasn't said something in anger they later regretted? Who hasn't felt an impulse they were ashamed of? The werewolf is the walking, breathing, clawing manifestation of that fear. The story of the werewolf is the story of addiction, where a person feels powerless against a destructive craving. It is the story of mental illness, where one's own mind can feel like a hostile entity. It is the story of anyone who feels like a stranger in their own skin, fighting a battle no one else can see. The werewolf is also the ultimate outcast. From the earliest tales of shunning and persecution to the modern trope of the lycanthrope hiding their identity, the creature is a symbol for anyone who is othered by society. They are feared and hated for a nature they did not choose and cannot control. This taps into a fundamental human fear of social exile, of being deemed monstrous or unacceptable for something that is an innate part of you. The werewolf's curse is loneliness. It is the agony of being fundamentally different, of carrying a secret that, if revealed, would lead to torches and pitchforks. But is there any truth to it? Any flicker of reality behind the supernatural flame? While men do not physically transform into wolves, the myth may have roots in very real human conditions. Consider clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric syndrome where a person suffers from the delusion that they are an animal. They don't change shape, but in their mind the transformation is absolutely real. They may crawl, howl, and believe they have fur and fangs. It is a terrifying glimpse into the power of the human mind to construct its own reality, a reality where the inner beast becomes the perceived self. Then there is hypertrichosis, a medical condition colloquially known as werewolf syndrome, which causes excessive hair growth all over the body. Throughout history, individuals with this condition were often ostracized, their appearance fueling local superstitions. They were put on display in freak shows, living proof to the uneducated eye that the line between man and beast was terrifyingly thin. It's not hard to imagine how, in a superstitious pre-scientific age, a combination of these conditions, a person with hypertrichosis suffering from a delusion of transformation, could have been seen as undeniable evidence of a real-life werewolf, cementing the legend in the bedrock of folklore. Ultimately, the werewolf myth has survived for thousands of years not because we believe men can turn into wolves, but because the werewolf is a mirror. It has journeyed with us from the dawn of civilization, changing its shape to reflect our ever-changing fears. In ancient times, it was the fear of the wild, the predator in the dark just beyond the campfire. In the medieval era, it became the fear of the devil, of moral corruption, and the beast hiding within our neighbor. In the Victorian age, it was the fear of our own repressed, primal desires breaking through the thin veneer of civility. And today, in our modern world, the werewolf represents our fear of ourselves. It is the struggle for identity in a chaotic world. It is the battle between our responsibilities and our deepest desires, between our higher consciousness and our primal instincts. The story of the werewolf forces us to ask a terrifying question. What is a human being? Are we the rational mind, the soul, the consciousness that builds civilizations and writes poetry? Or are we the animal, the collection of instincts and urges that demand to hunt, to dominate, to survive? The legend of the werewolf suggests we are both. We are the man and we are the wolf. We live our lives in the tense, fragile space between the two. The curse of the full moon is not supernatural. It is the curse of being human. It is the eternal, agonizing, and beautiful struggle to keep the beast at bay, to control the shadow, and to find the humanity within the monster. The werewolf does not just lurk in the forest or on the silver screen. It lives inside of us. And every now and then on a dark night, when the moon is bright and our will is weak, we can hear it howl.